Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for people who think freely, think differently, and think hard. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I had a blast on today's interview. Dr. Fuller is a fun guest. He's very smart, but he's one of those guests that'll joke around with me. I liked him, my favorite kind of interview, and on top of that, what we're discussing is one of my absolute favorite subjects, which is a new way, a different way to look at politics outside of the left-right spectrum. I think the left-right spectrum is reductive and usually wrong, and we've done whole episodes on it in the past. I'm not going to elaborate on that point, but I'm always looking for different ways to try to look at politics, and Dr. Fuller is going to walk us through his paradigm, Upwingers and Downwingers. And to whet your appetite a bit on today's program, George W. Bush, the Green Party, and the Pope are on one side of that spectrum about to be described, whereas Elon Musk, Ray Kurzweil, and government technocrats are on the other. It's a whole different way of thinking, of organizing the political landscape, and it's what we're talking about on today's program. Now, before we jump in, I do want to give you a listening recommendation that will help you get the most out of the interview. We have been so conditioned to think of everything as left versus right, blue versus red, that almost everybody reflexively tries to translate any new system into that. So you listen for a minute and you go, okay, I figured out who the conservatives are. So I want you to fight that urge. You're going to have a moment today. I had a moment today and I had to suppress it where you go, aha, okay, all right, I know who the conservatives are. I know who the progressives are. It's a different system. It's a different way of thinking. Don't do that. You won't be doing yourself any favors. This is a good opportunity, a fun opportunity to look at society with a fresh lens. And we'll be doing a disservice if we try to turn it into a synonym for the left or the right, because it's not. It's Upwing or Downwing. Right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Dr. Steve Fuller. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick and founder of its research program in social epistemology. He's written an inappropriate amount of books on a variety of subjects, but the one that is pertinent to us today is The Proactionary Imperative. You can find that book and all of the books discussed on this show by going to mightyheaton.com/featured. Hello, Dr. Fuller.
Hello. How are you?
I'm great. I'm very excited to talk to you. As I mentioned before we started recording, I am always very eager to find new ways to look at the political landscape that is not just this left-right spectrum, which I find to be very blunt and reductive and frequently false. And you have opened my mind to an entirely new paradigm. So tell us, what is an upwinger and a downwinger?
Okay, first of all, I think it's, if I could say a little bit about the history of how we got to left and right,
Sure.
right, that we're trying to escape from. I think this is the issue. So the left-right distinction basically dates from the late 18th century, and it was after the French Revolution, the way the National Assembly was arranged. Okay, the people who were supporting the king sat on the right, and the ones who are opposed to the king sat on the left. In a sense, it was about seating arrangements, okay, originally. And back in those days, the liberals and the socialists were both on the left, and the right contained a range of people, some of whom wanted the monarchy to come back more strongly, and others who, in a way, just wanted to keep with the status quo as it was. And that is kind of how we got this left-right distinction. And this served us pretty well, I would say, for a couple of hundred years, especially in the context of the nation state and in terms of democratic politics. And that's the context in which we normally talk about left and right. And there, what was, you might say, the bone of contention between the left and the right was about the relationship between the state and the people. Okay, and so you start to get this very clear sense that the state, in a way, isn't just about keeping the peace or a minimal sort of thing, but in a sense has a kind of responsibility for people. And then the question is, how does it exercise that responsibility? And the people on the right generally thought that the less that the state does, the better, right? And there are several reasons why people thought this. So it's not that everybody thought this for the same reason, but of course there were some people who we would normally call conservatives, cultural conservatives, who believed because there were already social institutions that in a way can take care of things without the state interfering. So we talk about the family, the church, that kind of stuff. But of course there were other kinds of right-wingers, and those were the ones sort of we call libertarians, right, who in a sense thought that the state, in its somewhat well-meaning but clumsy way, got in the way of people really exercising their freedom, right? So the right has this kind of combination, of conservatives and libertarians. Now the left, it's a similar kind of combination of different types. So the people on the left generally believe that the state was in some way a kind of engine for people to realize themselves, right? And that the state had to be harnessed and used, and this justifies raising taxes and stuff like that. Now there were some people who in a way thought that the state ought to in a way be in the business of lifting people up, making people better than the way they began, right? Kind of a vanguardist conception of the state, right? And here we talk about socialism, including democratic socialism, right? Where the issue is that the way you're born isn't necessarily how you ought to be, that in fact, the state ought to be in the business of pushing it forward. But then there are other people who equally call themselves part of the left, who are more of a communitarian nature. And these are people who believe that in the state, that in a sense, the state should be in the business of enabling people to be all they can be, kind of as they want to be. So if we talk, so in other words, the state shouldn't be transforming people, but the state should be enabling people in terms of what they already want to be. And this is a kind of, and you see somebody, for example, like Bernie Sanders, kind of trading on both of these kind of images of the left in the way he politics. Okay. Now that's the left-right. It's a very complex thing, as I've just described it. But in a way, as you can already tell, the left and the right are themselves very unstable, right? Each within their own sphere, they're very unstable. And this is what gives kind of the opportunity for new configurations to take place. And the thing that gives rise to the new configurations taking place is that the nation state, in a way, is kind of losing its centrality. And what I mean by that is, I think the best way to see it is the difficulty in democratic societies in getting high voter turnouts. Okay? So in other words, people don't believe that the elected politicians who will self-identify as being on the left and the right, that necessarily they're the ones who matter. That in some sense, the politics is happening somewhere else, right? And that in a sense, the nation state has been sort of evacuated of the kind of significance and meaning that it had over the previous 200 years. And this is where I think we are now, right? That there is a kind of crisis of legitimacy with regard to the nation state. And this then shakes up the whole left-right thing that very much presumed that. And so this is where we get to up and down, okay?
May I pause you real quick just to make sure that I'm following so far? While I would have some minor quibbles with your description of the left-right spectrum, by and large, I understand where you're coming from, and you're kind of saying that it made sense for a while, but it's become something of an atavism, largely because you think the role of the nation-state has declined in terms of what it's doing, and also the participation of the democratic electorate has declined. Okay. All right.
That's right. People don't believe in it anymore. I think this is right. And this is what makes it easy, for example, for somebody like Donald Trump to get traction, right? Because in a sense, it's because you think about it, right? I mean, he gives speeches where he's kind of talking about the crisis of legitimacy of the state, and people eat it up, right? They see it immediately. Drain the swamp. Everybody relates to that. I don't think this would have been possible, let's say, during the Cold War. Okay, in the Cold War, it was all about nation states, right?
No, the trust data during the Cold War was teeteringly high. Like, if you ask the average American in the Cold War, do you trust your elected leaders regardless of party? It was like 60 to 80%. It was exactly. Yeah, most Democrats, Republicans at the end of the day are good people. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the thing. And it's true across the world. It's not just the United States. It's true across the world. there is a real crisis of legitimacy. And so you basically start to see these kind of alternative forms of politics that are forming, and often they're not given the credit. They're not given the credit for being alternative forms of politics because they're not using the ballot box as their primary means of interacting, right? So you think, for example, about green politics, right? Or even the kind of politics that one might associate with Silicon Valley, okay? Where in a sense, they're not talking about ballot boxes, but they're talking about apps that in a way enable people to interact with each other in whole new kinds of ways, right? That in a way, either intentionally or not, serve to subvert rather traditional ways of people interacting that actually, in a way, were servicing the kind of nation-state politics of the left and right, okay? And so we see this happening, and it's especially true among the younger generation. And in a sense, this is kind of where the up-down distinction comes from, right?
Okay.
And in a way, what both of these do is they kind of rearrange the sort of unstable elements of the left and right in new configurations. So in other words, Upwingers, you could see elements of the old left and the old right in them. Same thing with the Downwingers, okay? And to just make a very kind of crude way of thinking about it, okay? So the Upwingers are the people who, in a way, do not take the biological basis of human beings on Earth as the final word, right? Who, in a sense, kind of, when they identify, even when they're talking about humanity, it's with something else. It's something that may have cosmic implications, in terms of, and I mean literally cosmic, not just in a spiritual sense, but blasting off to other planets and so forth, but also the possibility of uploading one's consciousness to a machine and carrying on indefinitely that way, right? So in other words, the Upwingers, in a way, have this very radically sort of self-transformative notion of what lies in the future, whereas the Downwingers are the exact opposite. The Downwingers are the people who say, look, guys, we're upright apes on Earth, and if we don't behave ourselves, we'll be gone, right? Bottom line, right? And so the more radical kind of environmental politics, some of which it fuels a lot of the sort of climate change issues that are going on now, is very much of this kind. And if you ask, what's the conception of humanity that the Downwingers have? Well, it's basically Homo sapiens living on Earth, end of story, right? And the thing that, in a sense, the thing that unites these two radically different ways of seeing humanity is that both of them are incredibly skeptical about the nation state, right? In other words, they don't think the nation state is up to the task of dealing with this kind of more comprehensive notion of humanity that has come on the horizon.
Okay, this is fascinating. So to make sure that I understand Upwing versus Downwing, Upwingers are kind of technologists, radical optimists. I'm thinking of like Elon Musk in terms of let's build a base on Mars, Ray Kurzweil in terms of I will rebuild my father and I will upload my brain to a computer. On a more benign level, maybe 20 years ago, people that wanted to back when what do you call it? There was a certain type of stem cell research. Stem cell research was controversial back in the 90s, but the Upwingers would be in favor of stem cell research. So they're kind of
right. In fact, that was a very decisive issue. Right, that's you've hit on something that actually was a kind of important tipping point issue in terms of distinguishing Upwingers and Downwingers.
Okay,
because when George W. Bush's bioethics,
he was against stem cell research, right?
Exactly, that's the point. In 2004, they delivered this kind of pronouncement, the Bush's bioethics panel, which said that the federal government, the United States federal government, should not be funding stem cell research. It was on the back of that then you started to get this, that the transhumanists started organizing against that kind of judgment. And you started to see, in a very self-conscious way, this Upwinger, Downwinger thing manifesting itself.
Okay. So far...
So that was important. That was an important event.
But it's interesting that you mentioned George W. Bush, because normally people would not lump in, say, like, the Green Party and kind of almost spiritual ecologists, spiritual environmentalists with George W. Bush, but it sounds like they would be both Downwingers, that there's a kind of older religious view of man is not a god. There are certain things that we shouldn't tinker with,
Yes.
and we invite through our own hubris our destruction. But then on the kind of the left-wing side, as you would put it, there's this sort of like, we ought to be living in Fern Gully. Like, we ought to be in an environmental equilibrium, and trying to tech our way out is to be contravened to the homeostasis of the universe, or something like that.
Right. Well, this is where the Pope comes in. So Pope Francis in I think 2015 put out this encyclical called Laudato Si, where he very explicitly joins together the plight of the poor, which is a kind of the social justice agenda of the Catholic Church. Especially, you may know, Pope Francis, as a Jesuit, is of the more liberal type of a Catholic, with environmentalism. Right, that in a way, the protection of the earth and the protection of the poor go hand in hand, because the poor are always on the front line of environmental despoliation, right? And that was the message of Laudato Si. It was a very radical kind of message coming from the Catholic Church, but it brought together the factions of the Downwingers. In fact, when somebody asked me, responding to the kind of point you were raising, what would be an example of someone who could really capitalize on bringing together these different kinds of folks as Downwingers? This Pope. And that's what he's trying to do. Social justice and environmentalism. It's a beautiful mix.
Mm-hmm. So then on the Upwinger side, you've got your techno-optimists, kind of libertarians, and probably kind of technocrat Democrats.
That's right. That's right.
People that think we can tech our way out of things and sort of view humanity as an open-ended question and want to keep changing it. Whereas the Downwingers are sort of religious people and environmentalists that want us to come down to earth.
That's exactly right. And that's where we are.
Fascinating. Okay, well let's pick this apart. In your book, you talk about the animating principles of these two groups are precautionary versus proactionary.
That's right, exactly.
What do these two terms mean? How do they pertain to it?
Okay, so we're talking about attitudes toward risk. Okay,
great.
All right, so that's the first point. So when we went, and this is an interesting way of thinking, this is what makes it kind of a new way of thinking about politics, okay? Because we're basically talking about politics based on risk. So risk is given, right? And then the question is, do you think of risk as something that in a sense you want to avoid or minimize, right? Because in some sense a threat, and that's the precautionary approach, right? That is the Downwinger approach, right? That's the idea. Don't introduce innovations, right, if you think that there is some reasonable probability that it might cause harm, regardless of the benefit it might bring, right?
Okay.
That's the precautionary principle, and it is enshrined in European Union environmental legislation, some health legislation even, and it's one of the things that is very often a sticking point at a lot of these global climate summits, right? Because there will be certain countries that will insist on the precautionary principle as a kind of guiding principle, and the United States and other countries do not believe in this. Not just the United States, China, for example. I mean, do not believe in the precautionary principle as having that kind of normative standing, right? So that's one attitude toward risk. Okay.
Wait, so let me make sure I understand this so far. First, we're discussing precautionary, and this is the hinge point between the Upwingers and the Downwingers is how they approach risk. We can get back to humanity, but that's kind of the Loki that we can talk about. And the Downwingers are risk averse, and so they're precautionary. And so if a new technology is introduced, there's upside, there's downside. We don't quite know what it is yet. The Downwingers are going to go, well, then don't do it. Or let's put a regulatory commission in charge of it and think about it, and let's figure out all of the details before we start doing it.
I mean, they think about it. I mean, if you want to put a kind of a positive gloss on the precautionary principle, because as you may know, right, I wrote this book called The Proactionary Imperative because I'm on the other side of the argument. But the point is, if you want to, if you want to give a kind of positive spin on what these precautionary guys are about, I mean, you think about it as kind of a Hippocratic oath writ large, right? Namely, do no harm, right? The advice that Hippocrates gave to physicians and the ancient Greeks, right. Was that whatever you do, don't do harm, right? And the precautionary principle comes from that, and it's applied as a kind of general ethic. And there's another thing that is also behind it, I would say, of a more metaphysical nature, and that's a kind of a certain conception of what sustainability means, and that has to do. And you mentioned the term before, equilibrium, and this idea that in some sense, the Earth, which is the place where we live, has a kind of natural equilibrium, and so the precautionary principle first gets introduced formally in the early 19th century as a principle of forestry, right? In Germany, given, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution beginning. And so the question is, how many trees are we going to, sort of chop down to build factories, houses, whatever, right? And the answer was, well, only chop down as many trees as you can replace, right? So it's a kind of steady state principle of what nature is about, right? And if you violate the steady state principle, then you're in some kind of bad situation, and that's where the precautionary principle comes from.
And there seems to be like a theological element to this as well, of do not play God with the earth or humanity. That if you're coming from the George W. Bush perspective, we shouldn't be playing God, and if you're coming from the Jill Stein perspective, we are, we're gardeners, not owners of said thing.
Yeah, so it's a very strange view, and one of the things that is really tricky about being a precautionary character, right, holding these precautionary downwinger views, is exactly how do you finesse it with evolution, okay? Because the thing about evolution, right, is that it, especially if you believe Darwinian evolution, I'm not saying you have to, but a lot of these people, right, a lot of the precautionary principle stuff is actually, founded on scientific reasoning, right? I mean, there is a scientific element to this that should not be neglected. But nevertheless, if you look at the kind of way in which evolution tends to understand nature, right, it's a kind of blind changing process, right, where species come and go naturally, right? I mean, that would be, if you look at Darwin, I mean, in other words, if you didn't come in thinking about this issue of risk, well, you just look at what is the story that Darwinian evolution is telling you, right? It's not that species are conserved, right? Species, right? They're there for a while, then the environment changes, and poof, they're gone, and another bunch replaces them, right? I mean, I feel like
there's a kind of inherent contradiction with it. I make a delineation in my mind between what I call ecoists and environmentalists. I am an environmentalist. I am for conservation. I am for protecting the environment. I camp all the time. I'm not an ecoist because it's not like a religious thing for me. I don't think humanity is a bespoilt, sinning plague upon the earth. But for people in the ecoist camp, there's this kind of idea that we simultaneously ought to be a part of nature, but if too many of us get together, then it's no longer nature. And I'm like, well, how are we? So, like, are humans nature or not nature? Like if we're not nature?
Well, I'll tell you what really kind of confuses the issue, and as often happens, things that confuse the issue actually make the issue prominent. Okay, and here I would bring up the concept of the Anthropocene. Okay, so this is the Anthropocene, which is a concept that now geologists use, right, to define periods of the Earth's history in terms of the kinds of changes going on. And so we've got this period now, at least, for the past 15 years or so, at least, the geologists have been taking this idea seriously. It was proposed early in the 20th century, but it's now given scientific respectability. And I'm not saying it doesn't have a basis. I'm not saying the empirical basis is wrong. But what it basically says is, right, that since the Industrial Revolution in Europe, that in fact human beings as a species are the ones who are primarily responsible for all the climate change that has gone on. That's basically what the point is, and it has to do largely with the increase in carbon emissions, right, from the Industrial Revolution afterwards, and the way in which, it started in Europe, but it then became part of the whole world. Now, I don't, empirically speaking, I personally, I don't have an objection with this as an empirical fact. I mean, but the point is, of course, that it becomes very damning if, as you were suggesting, you start with a certain kind of conception of how the world ought to be, right? How the natural world ought to be. And that in a sense, if species are dying, and certainly a lot of species have died and become extinct, and human beings are implicated, there's no doubt about it, right? And maybe, and more than ever before, no doubt about it. But the point is this what? This is not anti-evolution. This is part of evolution, right? So in a sense, calling it the Anthropocene, in a way, in a way, avoids the bigger question that we are part of evolution, and evolution has always had this kind of radicalness built into it, potentially, right? And so in that sense, when we're looking at this from some kind of ethical or political standpoint, we need to be a bit sophisticated, okay? And we can't just say, oh, just because human beings are the ones causing all of climate change, therefore human beings are bad, right? That doesn't follow, right? I mean, especially if you're an evolutionist, And so, yes, in a sense, this is where I think the Downwingers are kind of, the metaphysics of it isn't quite worked out, because you're right. There is a kind of religious residue, right? Which in a way connects a lot of this kind of extinction of species and all these bad things that we're doing to the environment, I think, with kind of original sin and that we bring mortality into the world, right, through Adam's fall. I think there's some of that is actually kind of built into this kind of perspective.
I'll tell you something I've been musing about, and then we can move on to the pro-actionary side of this, because I don't want to just I haven't just learned the term downwinger. I don't feel appropriate for me to just dunk on him. I don't fully understand the concept yet. But I was here recently, I've been getting into conversations with friends about energy and carbon. And I am in agreement that we have Anthropocene climate change that is being caused by the carbon, et cetera, et cetera. And then I will bring up, the economic efficiency of renewable energy is radically getting better. The efficiency of we're going to be fine, guys, and everybody gets mad at me for saying I think we're going to be okay. And I think it's because they're like, but we deserve it. We deserve something bad to happen to us, and you're removing the punishment by doing this. And I'm like, oh, I don't really see us as a guilty species deserving of the wrath of the earth.
This is the thing. Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, this is where it's in a way part of what motivated me to do this kind of distinction. Has a lot to do with the fact that I'm one of the things that make me different from a lot of the other people who talk about stuff like this is I actually believe the theological stuff, the theological backstory has not gone away. It's just been sublimated. Okay.
I agree.
And this is an example of it. There's examples all over the place of it, because theology is a kind of many-splendored thing, you might say, and influences the way we think in lots of ways. And this includes also the pro-actionaries. So the pro-actionaries are just as theological. Okay. Let's not Let's not let them off the hook. No. The point is that this is all about, I think, to a large extent, it's about theology. Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
And the pro-actionary, so the pro-actionary principle, again, we're talking about risk, and the attitude toward risk on the part of the pro-actionary is that it is an opportunity, right? Because that's, opportunities arise when there's uncertainty and nobody quite knows how to play it. And so if you strike first, you could take advantage of the situation, right? And that is something that comes about because of uncertainty. And there's risk, of course, because you may fail, right? So it's a kind of gamble, but nevertheless, you may succeed. Now, what I've just described here is basically the mindset of an entrepreneur, right? In the classic sense, right? The entrepreneur sees a kind of opening, sees a kind of opportunity, and then seizes that, doesn't run away from it, doesn't say, my God, I don't know what's going to happen next. No, they try to make what happens next, right? And that is the pro-actionary approach, generally speaking. And this is, and in the Upwinger mentality, right, is very much associated with this movement, which the pro-actionary imperative book is supporting, transhumanism. Okay. Now the thing so this term, I mean, you might want to return to it, and the various things that it stands for, but the origin of the term is very much connected to this point. So transhumanism was coined in the 1950s by Julian Huxley, okay, who was the first scientific director of UNESCO, and also the person in the United Kingdom who was responsible for laying out what we now call the neo-Darwinian synthesis. In other words, bringing together a kind of Darwin-based account of natural history, because that's what Darwin's strong point was. He was a natural historian. He could give you a kind of, long-term account of how species develop with genetics. In other words, with the mechanisms that and of course, knowledge of the genetics and more recently, the molecular biology is all 20th century stuff. Okay. And so Huxley, who's writing in the middle of the 20th century, right, puts together, and he's he's not the only one, but he's the one in the UK who does it very successfully, and talks about it as an evolutionary synthesis. And so he draws a conclusion from this. And the conclusion is, that in a sense, it's not only that we know evolution is true, but it turns out that we, Homo sapiens, are the first species to know that. And that knowledge of evolution, right? Because it's one thing to say that dogs and cats and apes obey evolution, that they do things according to the laws of evolution, right? But it's another thing to know that's what you're doing, okay? That it's that you're behaving according to those rules. And Huxley says this then puts a special moral burden on human beings. And what does that mean? Well, that means we ought to be steering evolution. In other words, evolution as Darwin presents it, and people generally in biology accept, right, is a kind of blind process. You don't know what's going to happen next. Well, Huxley says we can take steer of this. We can take control of this because we now know how it works. And so, in a sense, what Huxley was doing, and we don't necessarily have to go into this, but he was basically reinventing eugenics. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of interest in this kind of thing, but long before any of the genetics and molecular biology had been worked out. And of course, it led to all kinds of atrocious political consequences in the first half of the 20th century.
Wait. This is great, because so there's a lot of libertarians who listen to this show who they were with me going, yeah, slam down those stupid ecoists, those stupid downwingers, but they're in the same camp as the eugenicists. Like a eugenicist would be an upwinger, right?
Oh, of course.
Okay,
of
interesting.
Course.
All right.
Yeah. No. Of course. I mean, and of course, one of the problems, of course, was with World War II and the Nazis. It put eugenics into disrepute. Now, Huxley himself, as the first scientific director of UNESCO, actually helped some of the more prominent, let's say, German researchers working in the Nazi regime to migrate to Britain, the United States, other places like that, so they could continue their research. One of the famous ones is Konrad Lorenz. Okay, I don't know if people know about him anymore, but he won the Nobel Prize eventually and so forth. But the point was, Huxley was very concerned that because of the atrocities of the Nazis, that this whole general way of looking at evolution, where the sense in which once you know how it works, you have a responsibility to take control of it, would be kind of thrown out the window because of the atrocities of the Nazis. So Huxley, in a way, managed that transition very well. Now, Huxley, I believe, died in 1975, and toward the end of his life, like in the 60s and 70s, he was a guy who was very actively campaigning for in vitro fertilization, for example, right? And he was very aware of the molecular revolution in biology, and he very much foresaw that we would be doing stuff like, what we now call CRISPR and, gene editing and things of that kind. Okay. Now, you see, all of this, of course, is playing with uncertainty in a sense, because you're sort of bankrolling what you know into what you don't know, right? So we do know a lot about how the genes work. We do know a lot about the sort of biochemistry of it at a very micro level, right? But we don't actually know about what we're trying to affect, right? Which is to come up with, new species or more enhanced humans or something like that. And so it's the proactionary mentality that tells you to go for it, right? That basically says, you've learned all this much, now try to bankroll it into this new sphere. So you become kind of like, entrepreneurial scientists in a sense.
So one of the lines, I believe this is a quote from your book. If not, I'm going to attribute it to myself, but I'm fairly confident it's you. The quote is, "Are we animals suffering from brains that are too large, or deity suffering from insufficient resources?" Which I think is a fascinating way to look at this.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. Whoever said it is correct.
I think it's you. I think I'm paraphrasing your book.
No, and I think that's right. If I may say, I think, see, here's the other thing too. If you're an evolutionist, right, any given species and so we say Homo sapiens as a species, is a transition point, right? That evolution is always changing, and the question is whether we have any control over it. I mean, I would say that's Huxley's, and I think that's the original transhumanist position, right? Namely, yes, evolution is going to happen anyway, and the question is whether we take control of it. And from that standpoint, you're always talking about moving on to, different other ways of being, where you, in a way, bankroll your humanity into something that even has greater potential, right? I mean, I think that's kind of what the general game plan is of all this.
So back when I was in high school, I remember we were doing some kind of debate, and somehow it involved eugenics. I don't remember why we were debating that topic at high school, but I remember I was reading there was an ethical statement put out by, I think it was like the Orthodox Bishops' Conference of the United States. It might have been the Catholics, but in any event, a bunch of bishops got together. And what they said was that it was ethically permissible to do genetic engineering on people to remove defects, but it was not ethically permissible to enhance. So it would be okay according to that ethical rationale. If I have a child in vitro and they are going to have Down syndrome, but we can tweak that gene and remove that before they're born, that's okay. But what we couldn't do is we couldn't go, well, squirt an IQ in there. Let's just double that IQ and let's give them better math skills. And we'd prefer that they have blue eyes and 20/20 vision. Yeah. So Upwinger would be like, do it all. Let's just make a whole new baby.
Sense, No, in a sense, let's put it this way: Upwinger would have to give arguments not to do it.
Got it. All right.
But what I think the bishops are getting at here is the fact that Downwingers, in a way, so this distinction that you just raised about the bishops between the therapeutic uses of gene editing and the enhancement uses.
Yes.
Okay, this is a very Downwinger distinction. Let's put it that way. Okay. Because it's obviously very value laden, right? Therapy is good, enhancement's bad, right? Now, if you're someone who takes the Upwinger view and you look at that distinction, you don't see much of a difference. Okay, so in other words, and for some of it for practical reasons. So, for example, all kinds of therapies have all kinds of unintended consequences and stuff like this, right? It's not just dealing with the specific thing you want to deal with, but it deals with other things as well. So for example, I mean, it might seem a little strange to raise this, but let's say we have some kind of ideal of a human being that says, look, if you're a normal human being, you should be able to see and you should be able to hear. Okay. And so that blindness and deafness, in a sense, mandate kind of therapeutic gene editing approaches, right? And you could imagine, and these
reasonable to most people,
and the bishops would certainly go for it, right?
Yeah.
But the problem, of course, is, when you actually have had a certain percentage of the population who are deaf and blind, right? Then they find this, in fact, quite intrusive. Right. So in other words, and so there is now this kind of disability culture, which in a way is in its own kind of interesting way is questioning the clearness of the therapeutic approach. That, in other words, from their standpoint, given the kinds of cultures that one has developed from being sightless, right, or hearing impaired, right, that in a sense it is enhancing. The therapeutic approach is kind of enhancing in a sense that it would potentially destroy their culture that they have developed by virtue of being in this kind of alternative way of being.
I've spent some time with the deaf culture. When I moved to Washington, D.C. years ago, the intern housing that I had was at Gallaudet University, which is a school for the deaf, which is awesome, by the way, because you can sing whenever you want. It's great. I had a really good time. But I ended up hanging out with deaf culture, and I don't know where exactly we were with cochlear implants at that time, but they were new to me. I think that they were reasonably new. And one of the big discussions that was going on in the deaf community was you'd have two deaf parents, and sign language is a language, like sign language was developed it is orthogonal to text. That is to say that it's unrelated. Like Australian Sign Language is completely different than American Sign Language because they were developed separately, so they're completely unintelligible one another. And a lot of the parents were kind of having debates of like, but if we give our kid a cochlear implant, they won't need to speak our language. Maybe our language would die out. And so there were these kind of internal debates as to like, if we quote unquote fix ourselves, is our culture going to disappear? Because we don't want our culture to disappear.
Well, that's a real issue. Right? That's a real issue. And you see, the reason why I bring this up is because this hits the therapeutic side, right? The side that considers themselves, because what it draws attention to is the idea of thinking that there is anything that is purely therapeutic, right? Because therapy, again, just like the way these downwingers think, presupposes a kind of natural way of being, normal way of being.
Right.
And so this whole idea of wanting, every deaf person to have a cochlear implant, right, is in a way underscoring, right, in a way stigmatizing the disability, right? It stigmatizes being deaf.
I got it. So the distinction that I made earlier that I borrowed from the bishops, it is presupposed on the idea that there is a natural state of mankind.
Exactly.
And that is what we should be aiming for. And if we expand beyond that remit, we've reached too far to the stars. Right. We need to come back down to earth. Okay.
That's right. And the point is that the natural norm itself may be questioned, right? And this is where these bishops they haven't been sufficiently sensitive to I'm not I'm not the biggest defender of evolution in the world, but I think one of the things that evolution did bring to the table that's very important is the idea of variation within species, right? And that there is always a certain percentage, right, that is outside the norm in a very substantial kind of way. And nevertheless, those things flourish too, right? So it's not like it's just one kind of thing that's able to survive within a species, but it's a range because there's different environments in which a species need to survive. And so different versions, different variants survive in different places. And so what this then does is it has allowed for many centuries for deaf and blind people to be able to survive as human beings. You see, and there's a sense in which the bishops are not sufficiently sensitive to that sense of the natural variation of the human condition.
So what are some of the flashpoints between the downwinger, upwinger view? Like genetic experimentation is kind of what we've been talking about, so that makes sense. Stem cells, but
like GMO foods, right?
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So like Monsanto, I look at Monsanto and I'm like, look, I don't know whether the company acts ethically in terms of business, but the idea of making crops have better yields to me is just brazenly, obviously a good thing.
Right. Well, that's a good example right there. Right. Also, nuclear energy.
Okay, that makes sense. So nuclear energy, upwingers are like, yes, it's basically cheap, almost free energy with very low downside. But the downwingers are like, but it could cause Godzilla, so we got to not take that risk.
Well, see, but this is where the issue of how the probabilities weigh in people's minds about this, and this is why the attitude toward risk is the central point, right? Because the probabilities are not very high. But of course, you could kind of jack up the anxiety if you say, even if the probability is low, if it happens, the effects would be enormous. And so that then skews people's judgments on the matter.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so because if you're a downwinger, there's this kind of Hippocratic oath of just, it's not about net gain. It's about prevention of bad outcome. It would be better.
That's right.
Better to stop bad things happening, even if more good things happen. Whereas a proactionary person is thinking of just promoting opportunity. So if I am creating more venues of actionable things that can occur, most of which are good, some of which are bad, that is a positive thing. Even if there's some collateral damage, as long as the collateral damage is outweighed by the good stuff, the proactionary is saying yay.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the assumptions of the proactionary principle, which is not a trivial assumption, is that in some sense, you have to imagine not only that you're allowed to do lots of different things and try things out, but also that in some way the world is kind of open-ended in a real sense. So in other words, it's possible not everyone suffers the same damage, right? You have to, because if you're imagining that, if you get this wrong, everyone is going to be destroyed. If you have that kind of mentality, which I think a lot of the precautionary people want to get us to have, with regard to, let's say, radical climate change on Earth, right? We'll all be fried, right? It'll be that kind of thing. The proactionary principle doesn't have that kind of view of the world, right? The proactionary principle basically has a view that, yes, damage will be done, but in a sense, the damage will always be collateral, right? In other words, it'll always be to the side. It won't be the damage that will be so damaging that it'll prevent any further experimentation and advancement. And I think that's kind of a big assumption, right? I mean, so for example, I'll tell you one context where this proactionary stuff actually was operating during the Cold War. And do you know or remember, though you seem to be a sort of younger person, Herman Kahn? Does that name mean something?
Not Herman Cain, the pizza guy, but Herman Kahn. No, I don't know.
No. Herman Kahn, Kahn. He was the leading, in America, he was the leading Cold War defense analyst. He was at the Hudson Institute think tank. And he was the one who talked about thinking the unthinkable. Okay. And that was the idea of having a survivable nuclear war. Okay. He was talking about this in the early 1960s. He's kind of the template for Dr. Strangelove. If you know that movie from the 1960s, I do know it, yeah. Right, with Peter Sellers, the way the thinking that was going on in there. Well, Herman Kahn basically talked about scenarios about, what's the worst that could happen. So in other words, he turns the whole precautionary thing on its head, right? Because we're talking about a world where you got the U.S. and the USSR, right, continually building all these nuclear, warheads, and they're trying to control the escalation, but it's very difficult. And of course, these two countries are very suspicious of each other at the same time. And there already have been a lot of kind of false alarms, like, the Bay of Pigs crisis in Cuba in the early 60s. Right. And so Kahn, and this is a proactionary, we say, how bad could it get? Suppose we have a nuclear war, right? And his attitude was, okay, let's see what we've got. And you got to imagine that this is going to happen tit for tat kind of way, right? So, you take out these cities and then the other guy takes out the other cities, and it's not going to last very long. And you think about, okay, how much of the world's population do you actually take out from this? And so he estimated about a third of the whole population, and perhaps the third in the most productive, the basically parts of the world that actually are the source of the issue. Okay. And he said, nevertheless, that does leave a lot of people. And, under the right circumstances, these people could build up civilization after a certain amount of time. Okay. And what he suggested and what was followed by the United States, and you may know DARPA. Have you heard of DARPA?
Yeah. That's a big progenitor of the internet in many capacities.
This is the point. Okay, so the Defense Advanced Research Program Agency was designed to come up with technologies for the day after doomsday. Okay, and the internet was one of them. So if you imagine that the telephone system was taken out by nuclear exchange, right? Nevertheless, you wanted some kind of alternative communication system that was not that would not have been disrupted by it, but on the basis of which you could then start to rebuild stuff. Okay, there was no particular need for the internet. Okay, except if you imagine that there might be a nuclear war tomorrow, and that you need something else, to be able to pick up the pieces. And DARPA, generally speaking, had this kind of mentality, which I do associate with a proactionary mentality, whereby nothing's too bad to be thought about, right? Imagine the worst and then come up with the technologies that would still be usable. In fact, have an enormous amount of use in virtue of the destruction or whatever happens. Okay, so this is radical proactionary thinking. And this is, in fact, what led to the internet and a lot of other things. Okay, and I think that this in a sense is kind of the world in a way that the proactionary is envisioning. If you're going to talk about taking risks, and this is sometimes, by the way, one of the things I think transhumanists is they're not sufficiently upfront about. If you're going to talk about living a life of taking risk and all that jazz, you've got to realize that, yeah, you might get it wrong. Yeah, there might be a real disaster. Those downwingers might be right from time to time, So what do you do about it? What do you do about it? Especially, if you don't, want to turn the game over to them, right? Is that you have to anticipate in advance that there will be these kinds of damages done, and then come up with clever technologies that enable us to bounce back from it.
So from the Upwinger perspective, it would be better to move forward knowing that we're going to screw up periodically than it would be to just stay in the dark ages.
Exactly.
The Upwinger fear is stagnation and we avoid doing extra bad stuff, but all the current bad stuff keeps happening. Whereas
that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and in fact, within Silicon Valley, right, there is this kind of narrative that flows about how science and technology have been stagnating since the 1970s, right? I mean, you must be familiar with this, right? And that's part of it. It's because of a lack of a risk-taking culture, and so what ends up happening is that things that already are known to work just keep on working, and this applies both whether we're talking about science or technologies, right? After the initial breakthroughs are made, people just keep on, doing more and more of it in more and more clever ways. And so all that happens is people get kind of over adapted to what they already know and what they expect.
So in terms of if we were going to put this in sci-fi terms, the Downwingers are the ones that are seeing a disturbing future in terms of Gattaca, where there is a class-based genetic system, or Dr. Strangelove, where we blow ourselves up, or maybe some kind of horrible ecological disaster like Blade Runner. Are the Upwingers worried about something, or is their defining feature that they're just not worried?
I think what they're worried about is that we're not taking the risks to begin with, because I think they also believe that they don't actually buy the idea that there is a steady state world. Okay, so this is I think one has to return to this point, right? Namely, that doing nothing or trying to create a steady state world is doing damage, right? And I think that's an assumption that they make, and of course, obviously, I agree with them on this, but it's a tricky argument to have. In other words, how do you persuade people one way or another? I mean, I think, of course, if you really take evolutionary science seriously, steady state doesn't make any difference except as a kind of temporary local arrangement, right? So you can imagine.
I think the Upwingers have a tough thing. They've got rockets on their side, and they've got entrepreneurs on their side. So they've got some great intellectual capital, but the downside is they're having to explain opportunity cost, which is counterintuitive to human beings. Opportunity cost is so much more difficult to explain than hey, we're going to do this thing right now that is going to prevent something bad from happening, and going, right, but we're going to be getting 20% less economic growth over 40 years, but that's in the future. That's an abstract concept. And so the Upwingers in this weird position of going, but you understand that more people will stay impoverished unless we do this thing, but it's going to be over, it's going to be in the future, and we're talking about potentialities. Opportunity cost is a difficult thing to communicate, and I would assume that that's something that Upwingers are more worried about.
Yes, I think that's a good way to, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I think, and to be honest with you, I do think the Upwingers ought to be more upfront in a way about the opportunity cost. Because I think very often when, so for example, again, I don't know how much, there is this movement called effective altruism. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I've been trying to get, I've been trying to get somebody on to talk about it, because I think it's a great topic, and my listeners would love it, because we did a fundraiser for mosquito nets in Africa last year, and I hope to do an episode on it at some point.
Right. Okay. And they do mean well. But if you look at kind of the way they conceptualize the future, right, a lot of it does does trade. Let's put it this way: it does trade on this idea that we are on the verge of losing things, right? That we need to preserve certain things, and that we need to act now. And I think that in a way that kind of really does not quite get what our relationship to the future is. So let's assume, people living in the future, regardless of what they do, people living in the future will take their world as the starting point. Okay? They will take that as normal. Now, and just like we do now, and we look at how people in history talked about the future and how people were talking about their own times, and people have all kinds of views, and people talk about wanting to defend all kinds of stuff that they think will be lost in the future. And we're sitting here now saying, yeah, we lost those things, but that wasn't so bad to lose, right? Because now we have these other things, okay? And I do think effective altruism has a real blind spot this way. Because it's a blind spot that comes from its kind of residual precautionary thinking. So even though they think of themselves as being very futuristic, their futurism, their future, it's very much constrained by a sense of preserving what we right-minded, enlightened people think is good now, and wanting to make sure that future generations have it, can take advantage of it, and I don't see why we have to have that kind of relationship to the future at all.
Well, I will go ahead and top it off there. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've really, really enjoyed speaking to you, Dr. Fuller, and I also very much appreciate just having a new paradigm and heuristic with which to look at the landscape. I thank you for that.
Well, no problem, and let me know when you've got this thing posted so I can publicize it.
Thank you. I will do just that. What a fun guy. Not only did I enjoy that chat, Dr. Fuller and I keep it going on this week's bonus episode, available exclusively to patrons, in which we get into some weird stuff. We talk about transhumanism, cryonics, radical life extension, what potential technologies we are bearish or bullish on. We even get into a little bit of theology. Patrons, that is your forthcoming bonus episode. It'll be there on your feed, just as there is a bonus episode each and every week provided to you in gratitude for supporting this show and making it all possible. For everybody else, I'm glad you enjoyed the show. I'm glad you listened. If you'd like to hear the extended chat with Dr. Fuller about transhumanism, why not use this as an opportunity to step up, support the show, and become a patron? Head to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. All right, a little bit of announcements before we close up. They're not even really announcements. They're more of verbal show notes. A little bit of verbal show notes for you. On today's program, we mentioned some things about genetic engineering and cryonics, both of which I have previously covered on my unrelated sci-fi podcast, Alienating the Audience. So if you were intrigued by the ethical dimensions of modifying people, I have pasted those links to those sci-fi episodes in today's episode description about Gattaca and cryonics. Also very pertinent, I will put in a link to the episode we did a couple of months ago with Hiram Lewis on why the left-right spectrum is bunk. If you haven't listened to that, please listen to that. He makes a very compelling case that the left-right spectrum really is a useless, atavistic thing employed by dumb people and shysters, and we should all break out of it. And if you're new to the program, but you liked what you heard, go to mightyheaton.com/best of. You can go straight to the 10 all-time best episodes of the show. Just binge them away in one setting. Fall in love with me, fall in love with the show, stalk me, all of those things, mightyheaton.com/best of. But mostly, patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. All right, that's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. Thank you, Steve Fuller, for coming on to talk about Upwing and Downwing. Thank you, patrons of the show, who make it all possible. I will see you, lovely people, in our shining, genetically enhanced new future on the goddamn moon. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.